Thank you, Mark, and thank you to the GCSP and METO for the gracious invitation to join with you in this very important discussion. So let me address the potential impact on Egypt, but in a broader regional context, which is what I would like to focus on. Because I think the implications of this conflict for the region as a whole I think will be very interesting to observe. But first, a caveat is in order. These are early days with respect to the conflict. I think what we are looking at, it seems to be the first stages of what will likely be a very protracted conflict. And therefore, the global repercussions, including those with respect to the Middle East, will play out over time. So I think much of what we can say is still tentative and really raises more questions than answers. So let me try and address some of these questions that I think will be very relevant in the short and medium term with respect to the implications of this conflict on the region. First, I think it's very important to look at the regional political response and the implications for the strategic relationships of regional actors with both Russia and the United States. Now, Lina especially has touched, I think, very clearly on this issue of diplomatic hedging. And it's true, what we have seen in terms of the regional response is not so much any geopolitical realignment in terms of the regional response to Ukraine, but we have seen much diplomatic hedging. And this has been reflected in the voting patterns of regional countries in the UN General Assembly and also in the Security Council. It's also been very clear in the diplomacy of certain regional countries vis-a-vis this conflict. And I think that hedging is, of course, an understandable reflection of the tendency not to expose their position diplomatically vis-a-vis a very sensitive international conflict. But I think more importantly, it reflects the degree to which the strategic relationships between the United States and its regional allies have been fraying over time. Now, this pertains especially to the Gulf states in particular, but it also pertains to varying degrees with respect to Egypt, Turkey, and even I would say with respect to Israel as well. And these strategic relationships are gradually being replaced with a very diverse array of commercial, political, and in some aspects, strategic relationships between regional states and other great powers, namely, in this case, of course, Russia, but also China as well. So for Israel, this means a reliance on Russian acquiescence to continue its military operations against Iran in southern Syria. For Gulf countries, it relates to their relationship with Russia in the context of OPEC+. Qatar as well is a partner with Russia as co-members of the Gas Exporting Countries Forum. For Egypt, it includes, as Lina mentioned, a reliance on Russian wheat exports, tourism. The suspension of tourism revenues have hit the Egyptian public finances particularly hard. It also involves a very close relationship with Russia in the civil nuclear realm. I mean, Russia will be providing Egypt with 4 nuclear reactors. This is a very significant and large-scale deal between Egypt and Rosatom. So you see this wide array of relationships that countries in the region now have to balance in terms of these conflicting interests between Russia and the West. Now, this does not mean that regional states are willing to sacrifice their strategic relationships with the United States, but it is a reflection of the degree to which these strategic relationships have been strained over time. Now, this is, of course, a trend that preceded the conflict in Ukraine. And I think the key question is whether the war in Ukraine will accelerate this trend or force a recalibration that leads to shoring up America's strategic partnerships with its regional allies in the Middle East. And so that really is the first key question that I think we should look very closely at, whether the continuation of this conflict will accelerate a pre-existing trend of the fraying of these relationships over time, or lead to something different. Now, related to that is, I think, another key question of Russia's role in the region. And here, I think this is still an open question as to how the conflict will affect Russia's role in the Middle East, because we are looking at different possibilities. I mean, one possibility is that the war in Ukraine will gradually weaken Russia's position as the conflict in Ukraine proves to be a drain on Russian resources. So we can see a diminishing of Russia's leverage in conflict zones such as Syria, especially, and Libya, potentially, as resources are devoted more and more to the war in Ukraine. But we could also see the opposite outcome. And the war in Ukraine can potentially consolidate Russia's regional presence, especially if the war actually leads Russia to attach greater value to its military and diplomatic assets in the region. For example, we can see a potential situation in which Russia looks to its air and naval bases in Syria, not just in terms of Russia's power projection in the Middle East, but to the extent to which these assets are now linked to Russia's overall defense strategy, linking the Mediterranean to the Black Sea, for instance. And this, I think, is an especially salient point in light of Turkey's decision to close the Bosporus and Dardanelles to Russian warships. So I think that the potential role of Russia in the Middle East, that as it will be affected by this conflict, is still an open question. A related question is the potential repercussions of this conflict on regional conflicts in the Middle East. Now, Ali has talked, I think, very clearly about how the negotiations over the JCPOA were somewhat insulated from the broader conflict with Ukraine, overcoming this potential hurdle of Russian sanctions with respect to the implementation of certain aspects of the nuclear deal if we do have a restoration of the JCPOA. So that was one potential silver lining, in that it sets a very important precedent of how the necessary diplomatic cooperation with respect to these conflicts can be insulated from the broader war in Ukraine. But we also have to ask whether this is actually applicable to other conflict zones, especially with respect to Syria and to a certain extent Libya. And the key question here is whether the necessary diplomatic cooperation can actually be sustained in what is or what are essentially very fragile peace processes. So we see that certainly in Syria with the constitution writing process. We see that in Libya in the context of a very tense situation in which we have, once again, two rival governments vying for legitimacy in the Libyan context. So it's an open question whether the necessary diplomatic momentum between the West and Russia can be sustained to support these fragile peace processes in the region. And that, of course, touches on the longer term question of whether potentially the Middle East itself will become an extension of an arena of the conflict in Ukraine. And whether the war in Ukraine escalates to such an extent that both parties actually target their respective interests of the other side in the region. Whether Russia decides to weaponize issues such as refugees and other aspects of the conflict in the Middle East as a reflection of the escalation in Ukraine, or whether the Middle East as a conflict arena will be insulated from the war in Ukraine. Finally, I think there's a very interesting question related to the effects of this conflict at the level of global order, and how and what implications this has for the Middle East as a whole. I mean, one very salient aspect of this, I think, is the potential use or threat of use of weapons of mass destruction in Ukraine. We have the first allegations of chemical weapons use in Mariupol that are now being under investigation. We had, of course, the implicit threat of nuclear weapons with Russia's decision to raise its nuclear alert level. And we had accusations and counter accusations of bioweapons labs in Ukraine that have been raised in all the way up to the United Nations Security Council. So the proliferation effects in critical regions, including the Middle East, I think will be extremely important to watch. And I think it's very interesting how the calculus with respect to issues such as acquisition, sanctions, deterrence with respect to weapons of mass destruction, I think will be under consideration by certain countries, not just in the Middle East, but also outside of the Middle East. I think it was very interesting to watch or to observe the call by former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, calling for a debate on Japan's reluctance in terms of nuclear sharing with the United States against the backdrop of Ukraine. So I think the potential proliferation effects, I think, will be one issue to watch. I think, again, speaking on the level of global order effects, the whole issue of sanctions, which Lina mentioned, and the increasing weaponization of sanctions. And sanctions, I think, on this order of magnitude is something that we have not seen really since the end of the Cold War. I mean, the region has been subject to various levels of sanctions. We have the situation in Iran, we have the situation in Syria, we have the situation with respect to various terrorist groups, but sanctions on the global level that have been applied with Russia will have very significant consequences for the region. And the ability of the region to actually cope with these sanctions will, I think, be a very critical question. And compliance with sanctions, or obversely, a tendency to circumvent sanctions if the economic pain becomes too much, I think will also be something very interesting to watch. I think that the double frame applied by the West to this conflict, I think will again be very interesting to see how it affects politics in the region. So we've seen the West frame the conflict in Ukraine in two ways. First, as a defense of the rules-based international order and international law, but also as a conflict between democracies and autocracies. And Ali mentioned this point, I think, very ably, framing the conflict in this way, whether it will have political repercussions on the relationships between the West and certain regional states, I think will also be very interesting to watch. So you have at the global order level implications with respect to the strategic aspect of this conflict, but also I think the economic aspect and also the normative aspect, I think will be very interesting to watch. So forgive me for raising more questions than answers, but let me stop here and turn it back over to you, Mark.